introduce our next speaker, who's going to talk to us about the business case for Africa. Pat Thaker has worked with me at the EIU for quite some time. We can't remember quite how long both of us have been there, but we've certainly been there for a very long time. Pat runs our Sub-Saharan African team within the EIU, a specialist on pretty much every country in the region over the time that she's been there. Travels extensively across the region. She's going to be in South Africa next week for us, talking to a series of clients that we have down there. And before she joined the EIU, she worked for Ridley Montague as an economist in London, again working on Middle East and African economies. So has an enormous amount of experience on the region. And of course it's a region where China is extremely interested in putting quite a considerable amount of its overseas investment. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Pat.
Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And as Robin said, I'm going to see you through Africa. This is a very, in many respects, a very timely discussion for Africa and China. The media has been covering it at great length, good, bad, mixed reviews, whether you're here, whether you're in Africa, or whether you're in Europe. So what's in store for Africa in the next few years? Africa, as you can see from the chart, has been growing for the last decade, since 2001, and I think the Economist at the time said it was the hopeless continent. And thanks to the Economist, it's been growing ever since. But there's more than a commodity story there as well. And as you can see, it took a dip in 2009. To 2% because of the global crisis, so it is still vulnerable to where the global economy goes. However, it's a V-shaped recovery. It recovered very fast from the small downturn. Just to note, 2% growth. Something like that, if that happened a decade ago, Africa would have had a negative growth of 10%, and it would have taken another decade to find its way back up. So what is the favorable outlook based on? Modest inflation, steadier exchange rate, smaller debt burden, largely thanks to the debt write-off in 2006 and 2007. However, the countries have been building up their debt since then. Businesses can no longer ignore this continent. It's vast, 53 countries, 54 now with Sudan, immense natural resources, including people. So when you look at the state of Africa's growth, how do you view it? North, south, east, west? As you can see from the numbers, 8 to 9% growth, over 9% in some of the countries. In West Africa, Nigeria, Angola, the oil-based economies will dominate in that part of the region. They will post almost 8 to 9% growth. Ghana has joined that oil club this year. It had its first commercial output. East Africa is going to be the fastest growing region. No natural resources in Kenya, but the fastest economy, growing by 5 to 6%, thanks to non-oil development. Tanzania, minerals will continue to ride the flag there. Uganda, oil discovery. It will join the oil club in a few years' time. Southern Africa, South Africa is the one that is the most exposed to how global economy does, and how, as Robin's presentation this morning indicated, this is not going to be good news for South Africa. So where do you need to look? You need to look elsewhere in the continent. There will be some countries who will not do very well, like Zimbabwe and Swaziland. They'll be lucky to get a growth of even 1%. And that is purely down to ineffective political situation and poor policy. So what are the key driving forces for Africa? Many forces: commodity prices, investment rising, but there are two key, very powerful indicators which were not there before. One, rising external demand, especially from China and India, and Robin's presentation indicated that emerging markets will slow down, but fairly strong still. So that is good news for Africa. The second is the rising internal demand in Africa itself. domestic demand has been rising, largely driven by urbanization and consumer markets. As middle classes grow, this is one of the key areas that will be great business opportunities. They're already started, but it has a long way to go. Demographic. This is a very, very important part of Africa's growth. It is one of the most populated and youngest markets in the world, with more than half its population under 24 at the moment. By 2050, Africa's 2 billion will have overtaken India, 1.6 billion, and China, 1.4 billion. Leading the pack will be Nigeria, at the moment 152 million, followed by Ethiopia. As I said, East Africa is one of the fastest growing regions. Combined population of Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda makes it 110 million. Another important factor is Africa's youth under 50 is expected to rise to 45% of its population by 2020. This raises some very interesting opportunities for you as investors. They will want to learn, earn, and burn their earnings. Think Eastern Europe when the wall came down 15, 20 years ago. Think what Asia was like 20 years. There are similar symptoms in Africa today. And as I said, it's urbanizing very fast. 45% of the population will be living in the cities by 2015. By 2020, it's estimated to be 60% will be urbanized. By 2030, the continent's top 18 cities could have combined spending power of $1.3 trillion US, which means 63% of the population will be urban. At the EIU, the way I look at the consumer market, when you're looking forward for your business strategy, we divide it in 3 tiers at the moment. Tier 1, which is the richest, 100 to 150 million, which focuses on brand value, Gucci's, Prada, which is really, at the moment, the international firms hold the market there for them. Tier 2, which is the rising and the future middle class market, consists of 350 to 500 million. Similar segment to India and China. These people will be sending their children to better schools, wanting better healthcare, services, financial services, and will be shopping at malls. Tier 3, which is the bottom of the pyramid, is growing. Mobile phones have proven to us that there is a market there. Your challenge as firms is to move them from bare feet to inexpensive flip-flops. Companies need to look at all 3 strategies, but as new investors, existing investors, you also need to look at Tier 2 and Tier 3. Tier 2 and 3 are also price sensitive. As the purchasing power grows, middle market grows, that will become less important. Mobile phone. This has proven to us that there is a market. Against all expectations, it has grown rapidly in a very short time. And there's a very good reason for it. Very poor infrastructure, the landlines. So, where has it come from? It was subscribers jumped from about 0 in mid-1990s to 88 million in 2005 and continued to grow to 360 million last year in 2010, which is 45% of the population. What does it really mean? Ongoing connection, cables. 3 big cables have now been laid and more are planned. East Africa, Southern Africa, and Western Africa. This is going to improve the services, the way you do business on the continent. What does it also mean for the other sectors? Mobile phone is more than a conversation tool. This is a very poor continent. Infrastructure is still very weak. So Africans cannot wait for the infrastructure to be built. They want to communicate more than just that. what we have seen against all expectations, financial services developing on the back of the mobile phone. M-Pesa in Kenya has grown within 2 years. It is a tool that's been used to transfer funds and pay bills. Anybody who's dealing with visas or credit cards, this is the area you need to look at for future development on the continent. Mining. Yes, consumers are growing, demand is growing. Mining will still be the key area of growth in the medium to long term for a number of countries. South Africa, Zambia, DRC, still very much at the early stages, untapped. Very, very huge potential there. High commodity prices have been driving a large percentage of the FDI, and we've heard endlessly this morning whether it's a good or a bad thing to have the Chinese on the continent, focusing largely on resources. At the same time, what we've seen is a smaller number of mining companies coming on board, particularly on the back of the higher prices. They have actually developed the smaller economies like Chad, not DRC, but Eritrea, and economies that you would not necessarily look at. What are the key constraints facing the companies? Weak laws, land disputes. This is an important area, particularly for the mining sector. In South Africa, the black economic empowerment, land reform is constantly put back on the agenda, and it really does worry investors. Another key area that is part of the growth story is regional trade blocs, rising integration. There are a number of trade blocs already functioning and have been for decades. SADC in Southern Africa, COMESA in the West. One of the most recent ones that you need to take on board is EAC, East African Community. That's had a very sort of unhappy beginning, procedure, very much like the EU. It took 20 years to put together, and I'm sure you're going to hear a little bit more how quickly it will take to put it apart. But EAC is one of the most exciting trade blocs. Came into force last year, 2010. Key laws still need to be harmonized, but last year what it did do is free movement of trade and human resources. This is very important. They're planning a unified currency by 2012, but at the EIU we think it will take a lot longer. They've got a lot of homework to do, particularly on the fiscal and monetary policy. So 2015 is likely to be the date. FDI. As you can see from the chart, FDI has been picking up. There was a dip in 2009, like everybody else experienced around the world, countries, continent, because of the global recession. However, it was also a period, what we witnessed was a number of companies, particularly the new emerging market, China and India, it was a period to buy. Cheap assets, lucrative, with a very much a long-term view to being in the continent. Some of the telecoms also and banking services remain really one of the big ticket FDI inflows. As you can see, Bharti Airtel of India bought Kuwait Zain in 2010 for 10.7 billion. It was the largest acquisition outside India in Africa. What it did do is also overnight they had operations in 15 African countries. Also, Walmart US bought 51% of South Africa's mass market for 2.4 billion this year. It had some political issues and policies, but eventually came through. They're going to use it as a platform to develop their markets in the rest of Africa. South Africa is still, you need to remember, South Africa is still one of the key gateways to the rest of Africa. But as development takes place in the other parts of the continent, in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, this will shift your operations. China. As I said earlier in my opening presentation, this is a very, very important element of Africa's growth story for the last decade and going forward. It's more than resources. Yes, resources has been the initial big investment on the continent. But as you can see, from 681 million to 9.3 billion in 2010. And from the pie chart, you can see that the shift has taken place, that services has taken the largest chunk of investment as well. It's not just natural resources. Also, what is planned for the next few years is development of 6 industrial parks in key African countries. They've already got one operating and up and running in Mauritius. There's one in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, with a view to establish better infrastructure, better regulations, and it is geared to encourage Chinese firms to establish manufacturing industries in these industrial parks. Tax break holidays, favorable regulations. So you may ask yourself, if they're going to develop the manufacturing sector there, who is it for? It is partly for exports and also to meet the rising domestic demand from Africans. Trade between the two continents has also been rising. As you can see from the figures, it accounted for 12.4% of all exports from Africa went to China last year, 15 times more than in 2001. Angola's leading market for oil is China, followed by Nigeria. So there has been a real shift in the last decade, and South-South is taking increasing importance. It's not just all about the economic opportunities on the continent. There are a number of risks you need to take on board when you're operating here on the continent. Some of the key ones there are social and political, which I'll come to later on. But the key economic ones you take on board is the weak fiscal and monetary policy. Some of the governments, despite having strong revenues coming from minerals and oil in the last 2 years and this year, they have still got unsustainable fiscal and current account deficits. Something to watch out for. How are they going to manage it? How are they going to finance it? Is it going to have implications for your business, particularly for corporate taxes? Also, inadequate infrastructure, skill shortages. This is something that all our clients ask us, and they say they've all got their horror stories to tell. Inflation. Everybody's experienced high inflation this year, but when you look at historically, Sub-Saharan Africa, the inflation has been going down. However, for the foreseeable future, we still expect it to be fairly high compared to the global context. Largely because 45 to 50% of the basket of goods is still food. And also the infrastructure, the poor infrastructure adds to the constant problems of inflation. Power shortages. Food, like I said, 45 to 50% of the average African of disposable income is still that. So why is that when it's such a vast land? Only 6% of its land is currently irrigated. There's tremendous opportunities there. Agro-industries is going to be one of the futures. When you compare it to Latin America, it is 35%, and Asia as well, 25%. So can Africa become the global food basket? This is for you to find out. This is something investors and African leaders are constantly having to ask themselves. Poor infrastructure. This is a very, very important element, not just for people, Africans, but you as investors and existing and new ones. It is one of the biggest headaches for the corporate sector. Especially electricity and transport. For instance, in Nigeria, with a population of 152 million, it has the same power capacity as Hungary, which has a population of 10 million. Over there, investors can all tell their horror stories. A recent study found that out of the 54 countries in Africa, almost 47 experience more than 100 days per year of power shortage. That is a very expensive element for you to build into your business plan. Bottlenecks are also in ports, railways, roads. It's a constant headache. For instance, it is cheaper to send a container from Dar port to Singapore than it is from Dar to Durban. So that will give you an idea how ineffective it is. But it's also an area of investment opportunity. Africa needs investment of something in the region of 95 billion just in power over the next 5 to 10 years. So what is the business climate like in Africa? Yes, indicators have been getting better. Like I said, reforms have been taking place. Things are shifting in the right direction. However, it still remains one of the most difficult places to do business in the world. It suffers very much from high corruption, leakages is unsustainable, shortage of key skills, stop-go policies, poor regulations, and on top of that, in some countries, labor union issues. It can cripple your business. According to the World Bank, most of the Africans dominate the bottom of the rank. Only 3 countries really come out favorably. Mauritius, South Africa, and Botswana are the ones that are the easiest places to do business. Just to give you an idea, in Rwanda, which is a country which has speeded ahead with reforms, it takes 2 days to set up a business there. Neighboring country, Kenya, which is supposed to be more dynamic, it's got a bigger private sector, it takes 2 years, and this is with tremendous bribes along the way. So that will just give you an idea how it is. This is where you need to look at the trade blocks and say, I want to be in EAC, East African countries. It's growing the fastest. What do I need to do? Regional trade blocks will give you access. You have to do your homework and say, I established myself in Rwanda, which gives me the access to the other 5 markets. Social political risks. Than a decade ago on the continent. Just to give you an idea, 21 successful coups in the 1960s, 18 in the 1980s, but no more than 5 since the turn of the century. So you just got to keep it in perspective when you look at it. Political reform is taking place, a lot more elections are happening, but it's the quality of the elections as well. So it's, like I said, it's a democratic waltz. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. At the EIU, we have a democracy index which we review globally every year. And as you can see, this is last year's results. And every continent in the world declined due to the recession. And as Robin mentioned in his presentation earlier, the political risk, instability will rise as the economies are getting harder and harder. But Sub-Saharan Africa, did not decline. But you must remember it's starting from a very low base. What are the 5 parameters for the EIU index? Electoral process, government functioning, participation, culture, and civil liberties. Only 1 country gets a ranking of full democracy, Mauritius. Almost half of the world's 55 countries are authoritarian falls in Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of work still to be done there. So you cannot ignore political risk in Africa. Demographics, as I mentioned earlier, it's a dividend, but it will also overnight can become a challenge. We've seen it in North Africa earlier this year. There's weakness in capacity. Are the governments and policymakers up to the job of meeting this rising demand? No. How are they going to do it? So there's a lot of question marks you need to ask. There's a rapid growth in slums, largely due to urbanization. That is increasing social tension. Jobs are not being created, so they're not meeting a lot of the needs of the younger population. Crime, drug problems, security are rising. Inadequate education and skill shortages. This is a very important area, something that investors are constantly saying, yes, we want to be on this continent, we just cannot find the workforce. What do we do? It will take a whole generation and serious commitment by governments and private sector to improve that area. Healthcare is very poor in Africa as well. A lot of opportunities there for development. At the moment, life expectancy is relatively low at about 50 years compared to the global of 70 years. African Spring, will it happen? Maybe. Certainly not in the medium term or long term. This is something following what happened in the Middle East and North Africa early the first half of this year. Something that clients are constantly asking, will it happen in Africa? Should we be worried about it? Yes, you should take it on board. Shouldn't necessarily lose sleep on it, but certainly you need to take into account a lot of similar conditions are in a number of African countries. Authoritarian governments, single-party rules, but what is different is Africa is still a large rural population. They do not have access to the internet yet, it's less extensive. At the same time, unlike North Africa and the Middle East, it has a slightly better democratic record. They do have elections. However, poverty and unemployment are two big issues that has to be addressed. Finally, is Africa the final frontier? Is it emerging? Yes. The last decade has certainly removed some of the downsides on the continent. We have seen an increasing interest, not just from Asia, from other parts as well, Russia, Brazil. This is our basic scenario. On the left-hand side is my central scenario. Africa, ongoing reforms, FDI interest from Asia, fairly strong commodity prices. It will grow by 5 to 6%. On the right-hand side, faster reforms, political reforms, reduction of corruption. This is very, very important. It could generate 8 to 10% growth a year. And that is what is needed to cut poverty and unemployment. If it is not addressed, there's a third scenario, which is political chaos and civil unrest. But that is not any of our scenarios at the moment. So what do you need to do? You need to do your homework when you go to Africa. We've listened endlessly this morning at various sessions. Is it a good thing or a bad thing to have Chinese investment on the continent? Yes, it is a good thing. They're building the infrastructure, which is well overdue. 30 years of underinvestment, mismanagement has really proved that Africa needs it. At the same time, you do need to understand that this is still a poor continent. You do need to make sure that you are creating the skills and the conditions for Africans as well. It's estimated that there are 2 million unskilled Chinese workers on the continent now. Why? Africa has a very high number of unskilled workers. I'll just give you an interesting story. I went to see the Minister of Finance. I won't tell you which country, because I won't be allowed back in. And it was 3 o'clock. We'd finished with our meeting. And we had discussed about China. What's its role? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And then, as he was showing me the door, all the offices were empty. And he said, you know, Chinese are amazing. They work 24/7. We need to learn something. And he just showed me the door at 3 o'clock. So that gives you an idea. It's because the Chinese investment is based on conditions. When they come, there is a contract with the government that says you will finish a particular project within a period of time. And the only way some of the projects have been able to be finished is to bring Chinese workers who will work 24/7. That's not to say Africans are lazy, but there is a need to transfer skills as well. So, thank you very much. Any questions?
If we jump forward 10 years,
Right.
do you think that history will show that China has done what you were calling for there, invested in developing skills, putting in education, putting in infrastructure? Or do you think history will show it's repeated what Europe largely did, which take all the resources and give very little back?
Good question. Is it the Chinese responsibility, you have to ask yourself, or is it a responsibility of the individual government to provide the necessary service of education to educate its population? Given that that's not going to happen 100%, I would say it would have to be a joint effort. If not, then yes, history will repeat even with the Chinese investors. Yeah. This is something that Indian investors have started to do. They're a little bit behind the game. They more or less wanted more or less the same things as the emerging market, securing resources, investing in new destinations, even if they're difficult. But they're learning from what's been happening. It's a steep learning curve. Provided both parties learn along the way, then maybe in 10 years' time it'd be much more positive than what I'm saying. Yeah. But if left unchecked, it could be the African Spring. I'm going to wrap it up on that. Thank you very much.